of COVID-19. I'm your host, Joe Messina, Senior Director of IT here at Intalere. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize our Cybersecurity Advisory Board. The board is made up of representative Intalere members, and they offer their expertise to help guide Intalere in better serving our members. The members are Aaron Kartosian, the HIPAA Security Officer at Confluence Health. Bruce James is the CISO and Director of Cybersecurity at Intermountain Healthcare. Jim Kelly is the ISO at Samaritan Health. Mike Gregory is the ISO at Community Foundation of Northwest Indiana. And Kyle Guinea, the CISO of Virginia Mason Medical Center. We thank them for their service and thought leadership on this important subject, and especially during this important time. Our presenter today is Stephen Nardone. Stephen is the Director of Security Practice at Connection. With 38 years of experience in information security, his expertise spans a wide variety of topics, including risk governance and oversight, security program development management, security architecture, security policy and process, solution development and delivery, assessment, testing, security, and compliance. Prior to going with Connection, Stephen worked at the NSA for 15 years, directing the Trusted Product Evaluation Program for the National Computer Security Center, and was the NSA liaison to both the Director J6 Joint Staff and Director Defense Information Systems Agency. He was a senior director for several professional security practices, including Exodus Communications, AimNet Solutions, Unisys, and was the CTO CSO for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. As a trusted partner of Intalere, we appreciate Connection's contributions to today's webinar. We will save some time for questions at the end of the webinar, but please feel free at any time to use the chat feature of the meeting to send questions as they arise, and I'll facilitate those when the presentation segment is done. So now I'll be handing things over to Stephen. Stephen, I understand that you also, in addition to security, enjoy playing the drums. Will we be hearing any cool beats during today's webinar?
Great question. No, I do have the practice pad right to my left here on my desk, but no, the kit's downstairs and it makes a lot of noise. So, but thank you for the plug. I appreciate it. All right. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for taking the time to join our session today. And thank you very much for the great intro, Joe. I really appreciate all the information and background that you provided. I've been doing this for a very long time, so I get really excited when I talk to anybody about cybersecurity. In fact, I preclude the term cyber and security in my career from, by many years. But what we're going to be doing today is walking through a series of things, and we're going to start with threat. And the reason why I love to start with threat is that everybody that has a role as a cybersecurity professional, risk owner, whether it's a CISO, CSO, Director of IT Security, whoever it is, has to really make an investment in understanding threats. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. We're going to talk about what COVID-19 may have done in general associated with the changes or any reamplification of threat and risk. We're going to talk about some of the things that we have uncovered as a result of that. We're going to talk about how to prepare for the new normal. And that's really sort of basic information security, risk management, and governance principles. But we will talk about things that we need to do now in order to be able to address the challenges that we've been facing over the last several months as well. We're going to talk about a 6-point plan, part of the deck, and then we'll go ahead and we'll do a wrap-up. So with that, we're going to jump right in and start with threat. And so this particular slide is one that I've been using for 4 or 5 years now. And it has a lot of logos on it associated with companies that I have observed in my analysis have had some interesting and/or significant breaches. There's a couple of key points that I want to make here, that it is really important to understand who else in the industry may be experiencing any level of breach or compromise. And certainly there are several healthcare entities that are up here. We know healthcare is a huge target, very much associated with the amount of value that you get out of an individual healthcare record, right? And the ability to be able to build bulletproof identities if you can compromise somebody's healthcare record. The other thing that I want to make sure that I emphasize here is that keeping your logo off of this slide is really hard. Again, I've been doing this for a long time. I've been a CSO. I've been a risk owner in organizations and corporations. And the amount of effort it takes to step ahead of the malicious actors or the bad guys is astronomical. And we're certainly going to talk about that as we walk through today's presentation. So let's just take a peek at some stats. I'm not going to go through everything on this slide, but a couple of key points that I want to make is that one of the reasons why breach continues to grow and continues to be a problem, whether or not it's in healthcare or whether it's in any industry, is just the tremendous amount of devices that are available, right? So you think about overall the opportunity for attack. What does the attack overall platform look like? 50 billion devices are going to be connected or are connected as of this year. The amount of data that is being transmitted, 33 exabytes, huge amount of data. And so you think about essentially what that means is the environment that the attacker has, that environment-rich ability to be able to find devices, find data that could potentially be compromised in some way, shape, or form is expanding exponentially, right? So that does create a great opportunity for those malicious actors that are out there. And of course, we know they take advantage of it on a regular basis. And then increased sophistication, right? So we know with each passing day that the malicious actors are getting more and more sophisticated, and tools, techniques, approaches. And one of the worrisome facts, if you are a risk owner, is the amount of time it takes to be able to actually identify whether or not you have had a breach in your environment. I very frequently say during my presentations, it's not a matter of if, it's not even a matter of when. You likely have been breached and you just don't know it. And, in my overall process for how I handle, whether, again, it's a CSO, CISO, risk owner in an environment is that mantra, right? You never know, and you need to have a tremendous level of due diligence to make sure that you are doing everything you can to identify whether or not a breach or a compromise has occurred. 206 days is the average that malware ends up in an environment before it is actually identified, and it takes about another 73 days to be able to contain it. So, I mean, you're talking about pretty close to, 3/4 of a year from the time it actually gets into the environment to the time that it actually can be contained and you can lock things down. A lot of times there's a mistaken perception that breaches are shock and awe, right? Basically, sometimes that happens. The attacker comes in, ransomware, they instantaneously want to disrupt operations. But in reality, a lot of the sophisticated attackers that are out there come into your environment and sit there for a very long period of time, listening and learning, and trying to identify them is very difficult because they hide their presence very, very well. And then the last item I want to talk about here is the amount of work. So in this top bullet on the third section, expanding complexity, global workers, right? The figure that was put out, I think this was last year, certainly has been exceeded tremendously. The amount of remote workers that now are out there in the environment. We know in the healthcare industry with telemedicine making a huge growth over the last several months, has increased the amount of people that are working remotely. And we also know that the expectation is that this is going to continue for a period of time. The figures that I've heard, and they vary, is, maybe 20% of the workforce will never go back to a fixed brick and mortar site role again, right, in a facility, because we've shown that remote working is something that is capable of being done and sustaining good operational capability across the spectrum. So let's just jump in and take a look at some stats again, right? 89% of healthcare providers have undergone a breach. That's data that is out there and readily available. There are all kinds of sources that you can pay attention to that provide healthcare information, healthcare breach information. We know that there is a continued focus on healthcare. But the interesting fact, and some of the stats I've looked at over the last few weeks, is it's pretty much leveled off over the last several months. There was a huge spike in February associated with malware and phishing, but it's pretty much leveled off. So, the amount of attacks that are happening are consistent and are continuing. So that's an important message to take away. Over 41% of the population has had their protected health information compromised. I happen to be an individual that fits into that 41% bucket as well. You think about the experience of a breach, right? 46% of healthcare organizations have experienced insider threat. And we're going to talk about in the next slide the mechanics of how these things actually happen. But you see here 37% human error. And then organized crime, 39% of data breaches. That sounds high, but think about that, right? It's not 60, it's not 80, it's not 90. A lot of the breaches that are happening are essentially because of good operational security practices and human error. So if you think about overall the mechanics and the dynamics of how attacks happen, right? Some stats here that are really eye-opening. 48% is malicious or criminal activity. Over 50% is human error or system glitch. So what does that really mean? That means that we have some level of control in reducing 52% of the breaches that could potentially occur in a particular environment by focusing on good IT practices, patching, asset inventory, all of that stuff, as well as good training associated with social engineering and how to help reduce the human error potential. So that's good news, and it gives us some focus on things that we need to do. The average cost of a data breach globally is $3.9 million. This is last year's stat. Average cost of a data breach in the U.S. is $8.2 million, significantly higher. And one of the reasons why is the amount of paperwork and communication and response that's required post-breach drives the price up in this country to, double of what it would be globally. And then how much does it cost? $6 trillion by 2021. So all of this cyber activity, all these breaches that are happening has a tremendous cost and a drain on the individuals who are working hard on a daily basis to protect their environment and prevent these breaches or compromises from occurring. So what we're going to do is spend a few minutes talking about the threat organizations that are out there and are perpetrating some of this. And it's, across the spectrum, there's a wide variety. There are the somewhat organized individuals or groups that go after companies or organizations or healthcare providers because they think it's fun and they want to, cause some level of pain or anguish across the industry in general. Of course, there is very highly organized professionals, cyber criminals that create organizations that, go after all kinds of interesting entities or organizations or data. I think you may have seen a lot of buzz in the industry lately about the Maze ransomware, M-A-Z-E. And that's been targeting a lot of different industries and having some success in ransomware in the industry. And then there are the more organized organizations that we also need to be concerned about. And here you see these are nation state or very significant organizations that really make it their mission to do what we term in the industry offensive security. So they spend a lot of money creating tools, techniques, approaches, getting people trained, and really aggressively going after a lot of different industries. And energy happens to be an area where there's a significant uptick. Organization like Energetic Bear is an example on this chart. These are the organizations that have been tied to healthcare. So these nation-state actors are also going after healthcare organizations. Deep Panda is the one that went after Blue Cross Anthem, which, as you remember, was a significant data breach 80 million records compromised, and so they're very well organized and very aggressive. And these organizations are looking for healthcare entities to target and breach and get that key data, right? That electronic protected health information data, personal records on individuals that has a treasure trove of very, very deep information about that individual's identity that can be sold on the dark web. So let's talk a little bit about risk challenges. And I get asked this question a lot. Did COVID really shift threat or risk in any way, shape, or form? And in reality, all it did was create a focus on, what we typically talk about in the industry as a particular attack vector, right? So threat really didn't change, risk really didn't change, but we did one significant change over the last several months, which is taking large groups of employees in organizations and moving them from behind the firewall to a remote office, right? Their home. And so that threat, the ability to be able to go after an employee, has always been there, but now it's a little bit more significant because these employees are working in an environment that there isn't a lot of visibility and control over, namely their home. So certainly that had a significant impact. The other thing we want to make sure that we're focusing on when we think about this is that COVID has pointed out another thing, which is, we always talk about the ability to be able to connect from any device, anytime, anywhere. And if you think about that as a component, right, a large influx or increase in bring your own device has been used, especially, in healthcare environments. And you have to think about the concept of zero trust. And basically, from my definition, what zero trust is you can't trust anybody inside or outside of the corporate infrastructure. And therefore, you need to make sure that you're validating who's connecting and the devices they're connecting with before you allow them to get access to critical systems or data. And if you think about that as an approach, that applies really well to the environment we're in right now, which is, again, a large group of individuals that are remote workers that are working out of their home offices. And then another key perspective of this, and this is really important, is you think about it, especially for the IT teams that are charged, the IT security teams that are charged for protecting the overall infrastructure, the enterprise now extends from the corporate firewall into an employee's home. So every employee that's working within their home and their home network is now an extension of the corporate enterprise. And again, the ability to be able to see what's going on in that environment certainly is something that we need to make sure that we're paying attention to. And we'll talk about that in a few slides here. And then overall, I think about what's happened with business continuity, right? We've all understood the concept of business continuity and disaster recovery. Over the last several months with COVID, it has shown the need and the value of business continuity plans, namely, what do you do if there is a disruption to operation in some way, shape, or form, as we have all experienced, and how do you ensure that you can continue your business operations safely and securely now that you are changing the paradigm on how workers are connecting to systems and services. And obviously, this is a huge thing. And business continuity is a key component of cybersecurity. BC and DR are one of the domains for ISO 27001 and NIST 853. And if you're, an individual that's CISP certified, you have to understand BCDR as part of the overall security strategy. So it is a critical component of cybersecurity because it affects denial of service and availability. And that's really a key component of cybersecurity principles. So let's talk a little bit about the challenges specifically that we've been facing. And of course, we've already talked about this, but now you have all your employees that are out there and they're working in their homes. And the question is, are they trained to essentially follow the rules and the policies based upon that change in operational location, right? So they're really paying attention to the things that need to be paid attention to operate safely and securely. And security awareness training is something that I know from my experience in talking to a lot of customers has not been on the top of the docket for part of this overall paradigm shift. Making sure that employees are aware that now that they're in this different environment, they got to be more aware of what's going on around them than they did when they were behind the firewall. And the other question is, has the use of personal home systems increased risk? And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And the big challenge on IT teams and IT security teams, now that the network extends into the home and they don't have visibility into what's going on behind the cable routers and the wireless routers that are installed in employees' homes, what do they do about that, and how do they address that? And then the key thing that we find when we're talking to customers is, and of course, there was a lot of expediency associated with having to respond to keep business operations going. How much discussion was there associated with continuity of operations versus continuity of operational security? And we know that that's been a challenge for everybody. And the other is, have perimeter security controls changed or been adjusted in order to compensate for the change in the operational use, having a lot more remote users connecting into the systems that are in the corporate environment? Are we using VPN? Are we using multi-factor authentication to be able to connect employees, right? Another issue that is a challenge that we know a lot of corporations, organizations, certainly healthcare has been facing. And then the ability to be able to protect sensitive information. That information is now flying around in various locations that it wasn't previously. Some sensitive information that's being passed around between what was the corporate environment and now the extended corporate environment, which is in the employees' homes. And have employees been paying attention to social engineering and good video security and policy and protection of data and so on? It's certainly a key area. And then the other question that we need to be asking ourselves is there any type of an indication that what has been transpiring over the last several months has caused some level of compromise or a potential indication of compromise? So if you're a risk owner, right, you're director of IT security, you're a CISO in an organization, you should be thinking about all of these and working through these to make sure that you have understand the answers to the questions and have a strategy for how to be able to address those. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit more in some of these future slides. So this one is one of my favorite ones, right? So of course, it's a little bit of a joke here, right? Who are these new employees in my office? Oh, wow, they're my children. And I've talked to individuals that have had to deal with operational security related issues, denial of service, or system performance, network performance issues, because they are now operating within their home environment. So they're sharing their network with their family. And you think about all the individuals that are doing home education now, right? So you have students that are connecting into their schools, tremendous bandwidth issues and challenges. It really has created some unique issues and something that needs to be thought about. If you're an IT professional in an organization, you're thinking about performance, bandwidth, capability. Now that we've extended this into the employee's home, who's thinking about that? And that certainly is something that needs to be addressed. And then some of the other issues that obviously come to mind, who set up the router, the internet router that's being used, who configured the ID and the password, same question with the wireless access point. Has good security principles been applied to that? Or is it, for example, a cable modem for a cable company with the ID of admin and the password or password, right? Do we know the answers to those questions? Are we using appropriate encryption, right? So using WPA2. Are you using effective best-of-breed anti-malware? So did the corporation have the employees that are using home systems ensure that they were using the corporate malware, anti-malware? And, those certainly are significant questions. And then the storage of information and the sharing of information. And I've heard some interesting stories about people being creative. Hey, let's open up this Dropbox location for people to be able to share information, passing sensitive information and reports around through email that is now from a mail transfer perspective, not contained within the corporate environment anymore, right? So all this data is out there on the big bad internet. And a lot of this information ends up depending upon, whether or not systems are corrupted in some way, shape, or form on the dark web. So certainly things that need to be taken into consideration as you're working on your strategies. And then the other question, I love this term. This has come up a few times in some of the things that I've attended, and we certainly have adopted it at Connection, is the concept of the human firewall. And I'm not using that term to dehumanize the person or the employee. What we're using it for is to emphasize the fact that the employee, as the weakest link in the security chain, has to ensure that they understand the rules and the policies, and just like a firewall, that they're configured and they're executing them. And when that breaks down, that's when breaches occur. That's when sensitive data is compromised. So, what do you need to do? You need to make sure that you're paying attention to that. You need to make sure that your employees who are now working at home have a higher level of due diligence associated with validating who they are communicating with on the end of a phone line or the end of a text message, wherever it happens to be. And that because phishers are extremely sophisticated, the phishing campaigns that are launched are incredibly targeted. You got to be really aware because you can be very easily spoofed by somebody that can create a well-crafted social engineering, or in this case, email phishing campaign, or from a phone perspective as well, vishing, right? So you got to make sure you're paying very, very careful attention to that. You think about email gateways, right? And you're using email gateways, but just remember that an email gateway is only as capable as it has the ability to know about. So new malware strains that are not understood or cannot be parsed, or signatures cannot be identified by an email gateway, obviously are going to cause additional strain and potential breach in an organization. So one of the things in the second to last bullet I like to do, and I do this all the time, is use VirusTotal as an example, where I go to www.virustotal.com. I take the URL that's embedded in an email that somebody sent me. I run it through the URL engines, free, right, online, VirusTotal, and it comes back and it tells me whether or not, usually somewhere in the area of 18 to 20 different services will give it a thumbs up. Obviously, you're looking for green across the spectrum, right? It's been approved and isn't malicious in some way, shape, or form. But that gives you an opportunity to very rapidly test to make sure that you're not being duped in some way, shape, or form with a link that may be coming across. And then always spend time, last bullet here, understanding who's sending you information. If you don't recognize somebody that's sending you an email, you don't know whether or not something might be legitimate, an attachment that you got from somebody, and there's something in the email that just doesn't smell right to you, call the individual and say, hey, I just got this. Did you really send this to me, right? Is this the report that I really need to be opening up and looking at on my computer? So all of these are good things that the human can do. And then the last area I just want to touch on is the huge influx of video, right? We've seen a tremendous surge in video use. It has helped us work remotely, right? Because we can connect. We're using Microsoft Teams today, right? Great tool. So you can reach a lot of people, you can continue to do work, and most importantly, you can collaborate, right? But what should you use and how should you use it is something that needs to be taken into consideration. With telemedicine as an example, tremendous use of video. I had an appointment a couple of weeks ago with my doctor that we did over video, and it was fantastic. It was very easy to connect. Now, the question is there a possibility of a man-in-the-middle attack to get in the middle of a telemedicine video channel? Right, that's something that we need to be thinking about. Could that data be compromised in some way, shape, or form? But really, in reality, with video, the best way is just really good process to make sure that you're paying attention to the things that you need to pay attention to, right? So using and requiring strong passwords and making sure that people who are connecting are using strong passwords, using a waiting room feature before guests are admitted so that you have some level of control over who's being admitted and so on, right? Making sure that you're really spending a good amount of energy validating who's joining. Have people turn on video if you're running sessions so you can see the people who they're supposed to be and who they claim to be. You can lock the room so that nobody can join once the session starts. One of the things that I like to do, I find really helpful, is a lot of times it's hard for the facilitator to be able to really pay attention to who's joining, all those beeps that are coming on and off. Assign somebody to do that. Their job is to make sure they know who's supposed to be joining and they're tracking the overall session to make sure the right people and only the right people are joining. And then make sure if you are, storing and sharing information from the video that you're doing that in a very safe and secure way. All right, so hopefully, that was helpful. There's a lot of challenges that, in my experience in working with customers and just talking to people in the industry, everybody is facing right now, and things that we all should be thinking and adding to our overall checklist and process to ensure that we're paying attention to the right details. What should you be doing right now? So we know we're seeing a lot of change. We're seeing states opening up. We're seeing organizations having some subsets of employees come back to work, following the CDC rules and so on. But we know, as I mentioned before, that we are going to continue to see a large amount of individuals that are still going to be remote workers. So now is the time to ask, hey, did we do it right? Do we have the right protections in place? So thinking about the extended network and the remote workers, now is the time to start thinking about, do we have the right protections in place? Have we done the right training of our employees? Is everybody aware of what we're expecting them to do? Are they aware of what to look out for, right? To be able to raise that flag if they see something that says, this concerns me. I need to make sure that this is right. And then testing. Right? Testing is incredibly important. It's one of the areas that, we talk about a lot at Connection. It's one of the things as a CSO or enterprise security director, I've always made sure that I enforced. You can't know what's wrong if you're not testing. And one of the things you need to be thinking about is an external threat assessment. What's happening and what are the malicious actors seeing out there on the internet, and especially the dark web, that might indicate that there are things that you need to be concerned about. And then work hard. This goes hand in hand with the second bubble here about remote workers and home networks. Make sure you're doing something to increase your visibility into what might be happening with the remote worker and the home network and the systems that are being used, so that you have the amount of information and intelligence to make good decisions associated with what you need to be planning for moving forward. And this is a continuous plan. You need to build a strategy right now today, because you will be experiencing this for an extended period of time. We are going to continue with remote workers and the challenges associated with safe and secure connectivity with a remote workforce. And we are going to continue with a cyberattack heavy world. Now, I heard something, and I haven't seen any real evidence of this, and I certainly keep my ear to the ground on a regular basis, that would indicate that the hackers were also disrupted in some way, shape, or form with the pandemic and their ability to be able to access and to be able to run attacks. I don't necessarily subscribe to that theory. We did see a pretty continuous level of attack from February until sometime in May when the snapshot was done. There was a 600% increase in phishing attacks that were noted across all industries. So we know that the attackers are taking advantage of this new paradigm that we're all dealing with. And if you think about it, if you got a worker that's working at home, struggling to figure out how to get access, manage data, make sure they're doing everything they need to operationally need to do, they certainly are a more significant potential, an attack vector for somebody to be able to go after. All right, so what do you do? Number one, right, most important thing, right now today, determine whether or not there has been any level of compromise or risk of compromise. So the last several months, we've been in an environment where data has been shifted, data is being consumed and shared in various ways that were not shared before. Users are connecting differently than they were connecting before. Systems may or may not be corporate assets that are managed or not. Environments are, from a visibility perspective, are now out of control. You don't have a good visibility into a home network, as an example. So has that done anything that might indicate that you have been compromised in some way, shape, or form? Really important to be able to find that out. And then look at your infrastructure, and based upon this overall testing, identify where you need to focus your eyes on to reduce the overall attack surface. And I will tell you, it will most likely be that the employee and security awareness training is going to be a key component that's going to be found as part of this overall analysis. But doing it is really important to understand, did you make changes to your firewalls, or your networking, switching and routing, or your VPN, or anything associated with connectivity that would have made it easier for remote employees to gain access? And if those changes were made, are they risky? And so testing is certainly a way to be able to figure that out. And then the next thing you need to do is start thinking about the new enterprise network and the remote workforce. If you haven't already built a strategy, you don't already know how to deal with this, you need to put a strategy together that will allow you, and that's, 1 and 2 certainly do, support this overall process as well. But you need to be thinking about process and people, and you need to be thinking about policies and controls and rules for those individuals that are now in the remote environment. Focus on that human firewall. Really important to make sure I think it's 93% of the healthcare breaches that occur are through phishing. So, think about that. Humans are being duped by social engineering, which is natural, right? But helping build the skills to allow them to be able to reduce that potential is a huge and a highly valuable thing to do. And then create a risk management framework so that you know that you have a strategy that you can actually measure against. And we're going to talk about that in a few slides here as well. And then most important part, you never sit back, put your hands behind your head, your feet up on the desk and say, I'm done. It is constant rinse and repeat. The cycling through all the things that you need to do on a regular basis is extremely important. So you start with, some type of a cybersecurity assessment, right? Am I susceptible to an outside attack? That's really important to know whether or not anything has changed, or in general, right, from a general operation perspective, what is the answer to that question? Can my internal systems be breached, or most importantly, have I already been breached? And that's something that a really good external assessment can do, that has the ability to be able to assess dark web traffic and figure that out. And we're going to talk about that in a few more slides here. Is my network secure? Do I have a good strategy, right? You've changed based upon the remote workers. What has changed, and has that had some level of impact associated with network security? And certainly access control, identity and access control is a key component of good cybersecurity capability. And then, can my employees or my process be compromised? It's critical that you are working hard to be able to test that. And of course, that's when you start getting into the social engineering testing. So what are you doing? You're doing vulnerability scanning, you're doing ethical hacking, you're looking at your wireless infrastructure to determine whether or not anything may be happening there. You're looking at Internet of Things, or in the healthcare industry, really critical, Internet of Medical Things. So those biomedical devices, infusion pumps, scanners, all those devices that are on the network that are considered IoT level devices now, are they safe and secure? You're looking at your mobile device security and making sure that you have a good strategy and that you're testing that on a regular basis. Of course, social engineering, email, phone calls, physical security level attacks that can occur. Somebody shows up at the back door wearing the HVAC repair man's outfit, right? They get in. What do? Are they a rogue user that can gain access to your network and steal information or disrupt operations? Physical security testing, of course, is what you want to do to address that. Data security testing. Do you know what your sensitive data is? Do you know where it is at rest and in motion? Do you know how it's being shared, how it's being stored, how it's being used operationally? All key things that you need to be able to think about. And then identity management and access control, hugely important. If you get back to the comment I made earlier about zero trust, how do you know if you're going to trust a user and the system that that user has to connect to the network and to critical applications within the environment? Are they authorized to be able to do that? That's a key component. So, these are the things, again, you're going to be testing for vulnerabilities and missing patches. You're going to be testing your employees' awareness for security, good security practices and principles. You're going to be looking at organizational policy and strategy and structure to make sure that it's effective. You're going to be looking at audit and compliance, so HIPAA, high trust, PCI, DSS, all those things are all really important. You're going to be looking and see whether or not there's a comprehensive risk governance strategy. So do you have the ability to identify risk, document risk, and then socialize it, full transparency to those individuals that are part of the solution of how to resolve that risk? Of course, training is really important, BCDR, business continuity and disaster recovery. And then, making sure that overall you're thinking about your information security program that has good security conscience, awareness, and execution from the loading dock all the way to the boardroom. And that's a very difficult thing to do, but that is a goal that should be part of your overall program. And then if you think about a couple things that you need to do from a visibility perspective, understanding your full ecosystem and are there issues associated with security across the full ecosystem. This is a tool that we actually developed. I was actually one of the designers of this tool, and we use it very effectively. But the key point that I want to make here is that all of these areas, end user security, operational security, network data and cloud security, and then your overall risk and compliance security, audit, policy, controls, those types of things, are things that you need to be looking at and measuring and scoring in this new paradigm. What has happened with the transition in your operational process to cause a level of risk that you may not have believed you had before, right? Go through the effort of understanding this across the spectrum and looking at these key components and capabilities to make sure you're measuring has anything changed in your overall capability. I take, for example, down here, data governance, right? Has anything happened to change your overall data governance strategy and how you're dealing with that from a risk and compliance perspective? Extremely critical. And, one of my favorite things to talk about, and I will say that this is a tremendous amount of effort, and I know that because I've done this, dozens of times in my career, is to create a strategy and a framework for how you're actually going to execute your overall information security program. So all of these puzzle pieces that you saw flying in here are all specific components. This really is sort of a combination of stuff from the NIST 853 standard and the ISO 27001 security management standard. But all of these represent areas that you have to be able to address. Some of them you saw on that previous tool that I talked about. But, a key thing, authentication and privilege management. Are you paying attention to the concept of least privilege? Are users connecting to the environment? Are you validating that who they are before they're allowed to gain access? Are you authenticating that their role guarantees that they should gain access to a critical healthcare database or a critical financial database or a critical HR database? All those things are really important to make sure that you're paying attention to in your program as you think about all these different puzzle pieces and what your solutions are, people, process, and technology. It allows you to be able to get a handle on what you want to do, and then you can use that program to assess and measure what you are actually doing and whether or not you're meeting the bar. Very important as well. So you select the framework, whatever it happens to be. I'm a big fan of high trust in the healthcare industry. Of course, the HIPAA standard certainly addresses many key components that need to be addressed from a healthcare security point of view. The other is the NIST cybersecurity framework, the NIST CSF, which is a very good framework for being able to address overall good security measurement and maturity of your overall program in general. And then the last thing to mention here on this slide is threat intelligence. We started this conversation talking about threat and how important understanding and being a student of threat is. Now, if I could leave a couple of thoughts with everybody attending today, one of them would be make sure you are a student of threat. Make sure that you really are understanding what the threat is in your environment, and think about the people, process, and technology that you need to put in place to help keep that threat in some level of check. The cybersecurity framework, just real quickly, right, these are the components that are part of that. At Connection, we talk about protect, detect, and react. This is actually from the old information warfare principles that I was involved in when I worked in the government, but the same strategy exists here, right? Protect, detect, react, respond, and recover is really critical. And the other component that I like about the framework is it emphasizes the fact that you need to identify your assets. If you don't know what to protect, how can you develop a protection strategy, a detection strategy, and then a reaction, a respond, recover strategy? Super critical that you're doing that. So there's a couple things that I want to talk about, regardless of who you use for providers. Having a third party come in and do some level of measurement. I talked about how important testing is. Really important that you're doing penetration testing outside of the environment right now today to determine whether or not anything has changed in your infrastructure that could have identified or created a flaw that a malicious actor can then exploit. And the other thing that you need to do is you need to do some level of dark web analysis, looking for indicators of compromise. So what are those malicious actors that are contributing and consuming the data in the dark web? What are they seeing? Are they seeing malicious traffic coming out of your environment? Are they seeing IP addresses that are showing some level of malicious or compromise from a traffic perspective? Are they seeing email addresses that, with the broad-based domains of your organizations that are indicating that there may be some level of compromise? So you can see, is there an email user and potentially a password that has been compromised and is floating around on their dark web? Keystroke logger activity, visits to rogue sites. All these things are things that you can get from this dark web analysis. And the important part about this is that since a lot of your employees are now in their home network, the extended corporate network, and you don't have complete visibility, you can determine whether or not malicious things are happening or did happen based upon this dark web IOC analysis. Really important. And then the social engineering, right, phishing testing. Testing your employees right now and their ability to be able to recognize phishing attacks and be able to respond appropriately to those phishing attacks. Of course, users are going to click on malicious links. It happens on a regular basis. We run phishing testing. We get anywhere between a 35 to 60% hit rate on some of the well-crafted phishing campaigns that we run in some environments. But the whole purpose of the testing is to reduce that particular vector and decrease the probability that somebody is going to click on a link, which is incredibly important to continue. It's a continuous process that needs to be done. We talked about that full visibility across the entire ecosystem, which is that security landscape optimization slide I showed. IoT and IoMT security assessment, really important to know whether or not you have any issues associated with your IoT devices in your environment. Do you have CT scanners that are running very old operating systems that could have been compromised and are potentially trying to exfiltrate sensitive information out of the environment, right? We certainly have seen that in the assessments that we've done, and some type of a comprehensive cyber risk assessment, which basically includes all the things that you see here, all really important to make sure that you're paying attention to. So just circling back again, the 6-point plan, this is a roadmap for the things that I would like to have you walk away with, or the things that you could do right now today, important to do right now today, is run some level of analysis, whether or not you're doing it with your own resources or a third party, to determine, have you been compromised over the last several months with, again, this large change in our operational process. And make sure that you're testing and understanding what has happened. And that the key thing is, once you know that, figure out what you need to do to reduce your attack surface. What are the areas that the bad guys can get in? Reduce those and eliminate those. Think about your enterprise network and how you're going to continue in this world from a remote worker perspective. Certainly focus on the human firewall. The weakest link in the security chain, as we mentioned several times today, very important that you focus on that. And then think about your risk management framework. How are you going to measure goodness? What are you going to use as a strategy that says, here's what my expectations are across the entire information security program and framework, and how do I know if I'm achieving the right level of protection, detection, and reaction in that particular area? And then again, rinse and repeat. So with that, that is the end of everything that I wanted to present to you today. Hopefully, everybody found that useful, valuable. And I think I'll turn it back over, and we'll see if there are any questions.
Stephen, thank you very much. Very informative. I appreciate the presentation very much. For those of you new to Teams, you can pass your mouse over the bottom of your screen there. You should get the control bar where you can access the meeting chat and submit a question that way. You can send a chat to me directly, or just unmute yourself and interrupt us and ask the question. So, Stephen, we did have a couple come in, or a few questions. I'll accumulate them, I would say, into 2 questions that you can address while maybe people are thinking of other questions that they might have. First, we're seeing really long-term changes in the landscape of healthcare and how it's delivered, and how we're functioning as healthcare entities. What other long-term impacts of COVID-19 would you see, specifically for healthcare, as in the future with cybersecurity? And then the second question, you put forth some pretty staggering costs of a breach and the impact on an organization. What's the best way, or what would be your advice for putting forward the importance of that in funding the cybersecurity efforts that you outlined in the presentation?
Yeah, 2 really great questions. In the first, associated with what the future is going to look like, is going to be pretty consistent with what we've been faced with right now today, which is a continued use of telemedicine and remote connectivity for customers and users and IT support personnel and physicians, clinicians, organizations running healthcare entities, and so on. It's going to continue because what we're dealing with right now is going to be a pretty slow transition back into what would be normalcy. We use the term new normal, air quotes. Nobody has any idea of what normalcy will look like, but everybody from an IT perspective and a cybersecurity perspective is pretty much consistent with the same message, which is it is going to continue, and make sure that you're paying attention to what you're dealing with right now today, to focus on building strategies for how to deal with, again, remote connectivity safely and securely into your environment, ensuring that you're uniquely identifying users that are connecting, that they're connecting from devices that you have some awareness, hopefully controlled, but certainly process to ensure that they are protected in some way, shape, or form, that the data that people are gaining access to is being managed safely and securely in this remote world. Data is flying around a lot of different areas that it may not have been before from a sharing point of view. Certainly making sure if you're doing telemedicine, you're doing video, you're sharing sensitive healthcare related data, that there is some level of analysis that ensures that you're comfortable with the protection scheme and your video and your telemedicine services. And then, again, it's that human firewall, right? Make sure that everybody is aware of what their role and function is. Super critical. And it doesn't make a difference whether or not we're in a pandemic or not. All of those principles are incredibly important anyway. The only difference in what we're dealing with today is that there are a lot more people that are in a higher risk environment than they were before and are connecting to critical assets and critical data differently than they were before. And we need to assess whether or not there is a risk and potential breach or compromise associated with that. So that will certainly continue. On the second question, I think you're right. There is a huge cost. I know in my experience in dealing with some customers that, in healthcare environment, I've seen ransomware that essentially has taken full operation of a hospital to its knees. And you think about the impact of that. Think about surgery as an example. Think about all the devices that are required for patient care. If those things are inaccessible because ransomware has locked down the servers and the capabilities that run those things, that's hugely impactful. So the best way to deal with that, again, make sure that you're a student of threat. Make sure that you understand what the potential is out there. Make sure you're studying other organizations. I'm sure everybody on this call is aware of the wall of shame, as it's called, that is out there that lists all the different breaches. I take issue with wall of shame because as a risk owner in my life, I know how hard it is to keep an environment safe, but that information, who's been breached and how they've been breached, make sure that you're a student of that. You understand that. I said 93% of the attacks that are happening are phishing-based, right? So if you really focus on employee training and awareness and you create a mechanism, what's the most important thing to do? Create a communication channel for anybody that says, this doesn't look right, what do I do? There's an email chain or there's a phone number they can call to say, hey, I just saw this and I don't know what to do. And there's somebody on the other end of the line to respond and help them make good choices, right? That's a huge benefit. But with all that information, now you can go to corporate leadership and you can say, hey, I know we haven't experienced a breach, but this is happening to everybody out there, and we need to be prepared because the cost of recovery is going to be a heck of a lot more than the cost of putting some good protection, detection, and reaction schemes in place to help you potentially prevent that breach from occurring.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I don't see any further questions at this time. Again, if you want to unmute yourself and interrupt, feel free. But I'll take the opportunity to thank our advisory board for their input. And for you, Stephen, for a great presentation today. We really value our partnership with Connection. And with that, thanks to everybody who attended. That should wrap up today's webinar.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. Everybody have a great day.